candidates. In 2019, our annual Monster Mash Halloween party raised almost $30,000 for Senator Doug Jones's reelection campaign. And this year, we have already contributed to Democratic candidates in 5 competitive Senate races across the country. And also, before we begin, we would like to give a special thanks to William Maservi, Pam Caruso, Karen Korb for sponsoring this event and for their continued support of Persistence PAC. And although the speaker series is a free event, if you have the means to do so, we would strongly encourage you to donate tonight to help Democrats in Alabama. Your donation, no matter the size, can make an impact in the upcoming election. There will be a donation link pinned to the top of the chat box below if you feel moved to contribute whatever you can. And now, to get to our speaker for the evening, which you all came here for. Our speaker tonight is Joyce White Vance. She is a distinguished professor of the practice of law. She was nominated for the position of U.S. Attorney for the Northern District of Alabama by President Barack Obama in May of 2009, and unanimously confirmed by the Senate in August of 2009, serving in that position from 2009 to 2017. Professor Vance served on the Attorney General's Advisory Committee and was the co-chair of its Criminal Practice Subcommittee. And before becoming a U.S. Attorney, Professor Vance served as an assistant U.S. Attorney in Birmingham for 18 years, as well as spending 10 years as a criminal prosecutor before moving to the Appellate Division in 2002, where she became the chief of that division in 2005. Professor Vance received a BA from Bates College in Lewiston, Maine, and a JD from the University of Virginia School of Law. And recently, Professor Vance received the University of Alabama at Birmingham School of Public Health's Lou Worcester Public Health Hero Award for her leadership in creating a community-engaged initiative that included partners from law enforcement, the medical and business communities, and educators to address the heroin and opioid epidemic in Northern Alabama. She is also a frequent legal commentator for multiple news outlets, and she would have liked me to say she is also the long-suffering wife of the loved Judge Bob Vance. So hi, Joyce. Thank you so much for being here with us tonight.
Thanks so much for having me. And I always appreciate the shout out to Bob. I really am his long-suffering wife.
Well, we love both you and Bob here, for sure.
I know he appreciates the love and support too.
So to kick things off, let's do some framing as we get started here. You and other legal analysts and former government folks talk a lot about the rule of law. I know that's kind of a big topic, but what is meant by that exactly?
Sure. Well, I think that that's the perfect place to start, Lisa. And let me first, before we get started, thank you all very much for having me. It's really nice to be in a virtual room full of smart people who want to think about the future of our constitutional republic. So I appreciate you having me. Second, let me apologize for the horrible lighting. For those of you on Twitter who follow the guys who rate people's backdrops, I'm at about a 2 out of 10 tonight, but unfortunately I've lost my lighting. So I hope it's not terrible. That said, the rule of law. The rule of law is something that folks like me who were involved in government thought about an awful lot and never had public conversations about before the Trump administration brought it into a sharper focus. So I think it's important for us to talk about it. I actually teach a class, a seminar, where we talk extensively about the rule of law. And one of the things the students are always surprised to learn is that there is no broadly accepted universal definition of the rule of law. But we do have some system where the rules are clear and publicly available. Everybody knows what they are, and they apply to all people equally. The reason there's not one uniform definition of rule of law is it really is very situational, and it can mean different things in developing countries than it does in the United States, which is commonly perceived as one of the most developed rule of law countries in the world. But the core of the rule of law is this. It's the notion that no one, no man is above the law. That's because the founding fathers wrote the Constitution in response to the political systems that they were rejecting, which involved kings or monarchical rulers who were in many ways dictatorial in their exercise of the laws. And the law operated at the whim of the monarch. The monarch could avoid personally the rule of law, could use it to benefit his or her friends, and could use it to harm his enemies. And so the founding fathers set up a system of redundant checks and balances to make sure that that couldn't happen in this country.
Great. Well, so on that note, what are people so concerned about in terms of the threats to the rule of law?
So for one thing, let's be, I think, upfront about the fact that no one party has a monopoly on maybe getting a little bit too close to constitutional boundaries. There have been, for at least as long as I've been alive, which is a long time, concerns with most presidencies that there are areas where they have come close to violating the rule of law. Some presidencies are standouts. Richard Nixon was, of course, a standout. The Iran-Contra affair during Bush 1 was a standout. And of course, in this presidency, we're seeing an enormous number of challenges to the rule of law. And this, I think, is the crux of the issue. We have a relatively strong system of democratic institutions in this country, and they form the architecture that supports the rule of law. So we have a Justice Department. We have a military with a strong tradition of independence like DOJ's. We have educational systems. We have 3 branches of government. This architecture is in place to support the rule of law. And the question that I think many of us have found ourselves asking is, are the challenges so sustained on so many fronts, so pervasive, with so little response from what we would have expected to be a more effective 3 branches checks and balance system, that the actual rule of law itself is at risk? And I think that's the question that folks are discussing with different levels of analysis.
Absolutely. And I think this kind of takes us straight into the topic of major concern in these last couple of weeks. I'm sure people on here would agree. Attorney General Bill Barr, and whether he is acting as the people's lawyer or the president's lawyer, a lot would say, more of a fixer than a public servant. Can you kind of outline for us what's been happening with that?
Yeah, so I think that that's exactly the right question, Lisa. The notion is whether this is a man fulfilling the traditional role of an attorney general, the people's lawyer, or whether he's acting as the president's fixer. And I always remember, as does the entire class of Obama US attorneys, one of our rare moments of interaction with the president. We didn't have a lot of interaction with President Obama, and that was by design because we were not his lawyers. We were meant to be lawyers representing the people, and we were required to do that with independence. And so on one occasion, we were very formally staged in a room in the White House, and he came in to speak with us equally formally. And he was sort of joking around and being funny. He's very good at that. And then he sort of turned serious for a moment and he said, I appointed you. But you don't serve me. You serve the American people. And I expect you to do that with independence and with integrity. And that became sort of a North Star for all of us, that notion that our job was to be independent and to act with integrity. And so that takes us, I suppose, to Bill Barr, the current Attorney General, who in his first weeks in office lied to the American people about what was in the Mueller report, claiming that it was a total exoneration of the president. He maintained that for almost a month. And as we all know, first impressions are powerful. It's very difficult to undo a first impression. And so Bill Barr successfully put out the president's narrative on the outcome of the Mueller report. The only problem was it just wasn't true. And once we all had even the redacted version of the report and began to read it, we knew that. So fast forward to where we are today. In the last 6 weeks or so, we've seen some deeply troubling actions by this Attorney General. He has interfered far too much and has permitted the White House to interfere far too much in criminal prosecutions. So let's be clear about something. The Attorney General is appointed by the president and he works for him, right? And that's entirely appropriate on policy matters. The White House, for instance, can decide what it wants its criminal justice policy to be, whether it wants it to be a tough on crime approach or a smart on crime approach, and the Attorney General is supposed to carry that policy forward. Here's where the White House can't interfere. The White House can't tell the president who to prosecute or who to cut a sweetheart's deal to. And we all know why now, because we've had, y'all, I'm being joined by my German Shepherd puppy, Bella. I'm not sure if you can see her, but she's decided to join us. And that's because we know that the founding fathers' intention was that no one should be above the law. In other words, for prosecutors, that means prosecuting without fear or without favor. You don't give the president's friends a break. You don't give the president's enemies a hard time. Hi, Bella. Yes, she's obviously very excited about the rule of law. She's never done this before. And so Bill Barr has persistently permitted that level of interference. We've seen that recently in the Roger Stone case, in the Mike Flynn case, where DOJ did this incredible about face and sought a dismissal of a case after Mike Flynn, the president's first national security advisor, had pleaded guilty under oath in a criminal court and said, "I'm guilty, I did it," and agreed to the conviction. And then, of course, we've also seen the most recent reports that Bill Barr tried to interfere in the Michael Cohen case, tried in the earliest days of his tenure to see if he could undercut that conviction. Now, why might he want to undercut the conviction of someone who actually seems to have gotten outside of the president's fold? That's not someone that you would think that Barr would want to do a favor for. I know you all remember the indictment in Cohen's case, which referred to an unindicted co-conspirator, individual one, who was involved in a scam to pay off women with whom he had had affairs in violation of campaign finance law. That person, it turns out, would be the president, Donald Trump. And so by seeking to undercut those aspects of the Cohen indictment that also could lead to charges against the president were he not sitting in the White House, Barr clearly is perceived as trying to do favors for the president, as he does with the Roger Stone prosecution with the greatly reduced sentencing recommendation, as he in Flynn. One of the things that I've seen expert commentators take away from this is that it's possible that the president did not want to take the political hit for pardoning these people, that there was perception that the damage would be too great this close to an election. And so by having Bill Barr do his dirty work, he was protecting his own, let's just say, political survivability. So this is enormously troubling. Bill Barr plays a role that no attorney general should play. And of course, most recently, he shows up at the protests in Lafayette Park in Washington, D.C., where people are peacefully assembled and protesting, and gives the order to use tear gas and rubber bullets, playing a role that, frankly, it's unimaginable. And just for a second, sort of close your eyes and imagine Eric Holder doing that for Barack Obama. Or think further back and imagine Alberto Gonzalez, who had to actually resign as Attorney General over the firing scandal of US attorneys. And even though he had to resign, now imagine him trying to order the tear gassing of American protesters. And I bet you can't do it. It's simply unimaginable.
So much great in that. And to that, as we were talking about Bill Barr, he kind of came into the administration with good bona fides. I mean, many of Trump's administration were new to government, most, I think we could say. And Barr at least was experienced and respected by many people. What do you think went wrong there?
It's such a good question. You know, Barr was previously an attorney general. In fact, I'm old enough that I actually worked for him when he was the acting attorney general the first time. There were riots in the prison in Talladega. He was very involved in the strategy in that case. He was well received by people in my office in that role. But Bill Barr also had a problem when he was attorney general that involved recommending pardons to many of the players in the Iran-Contra scandal. At the time, he was roundly criticized, even by members of the Republican Party, for the role that he played there. But at the point in time where Trump nominated him as the Attorney General, many people believed that he would be an institutionalist. He believed in DOJ and in the mission, and they were excited about seeing him come on board. I will confess that I was not. I actually wrote in opposition to his confirmation, based less on his conduct as an attorney general in the past, and more on the fact that he had written this really curious memo. It was a 19-page unsolicited memo in which Barr set forth an expansive view of the presidential powers and the presidency, and went so far as to opine that a president could not commit obstruction of justice. I know you all can remember this moment in time when there was a robust debate over whether a president could be indicted ever while in office and whether or not a president could commit obstruction of justice. And here was Bill Barr with what until then had been sort of this fringe view of just expansive executive power. And he writes this memo, which somehow ends up in the White House and at DOJ while the president is trying to pick a new attorney general, after Jeff Sessions is gone and while Matt Whitaker is the acting attorney general. And Barr, in my judgment, auditioned for the job by prejudging the fact that the president could not be indicted or successfully convicted. And on that basis, I said, if he really is an institutionalist, if he really does love DOJ, then he should take himself out of the running because of the damage this perception of a conflict would do to DOJ, even if his motives are pure. Just the perception alone would be deeply damaging. So I, of course, got that really, really wrong. I completely underestimated what Barr was capable and the threat that he faced, and this notion that it was the appearance of impropriety, not actual impropriety. But I think increasingly it's clear that Barr is who he has always been. Someone who's just a lot more interested in being the president's Roy Cohn than any attorney general should ever get close to being.
Well, as you mentioned earlier, Barr kind of hit the ground running for the president with this misleading summary of the Mueller report and his claim that the president was fully exonerated. Now, Russia has been back in the news again this week, as we all know. And so what are we to make of all of that?
So this is such a wildly evolving story. And the first thing that we heard was this notion that the president had been briefed on the fact that Russia was essentially engaged in a murder for hire scheme with the Taliban, and the victim, the target of that murder for hire scheme was American soldiers. Of course, the president initially denied that he had briefed on that, didn't deny the truth of the allegations, but denied that he had been briefed. Subsequently, information came to light that it was in fact included in the president's daily brief and that he had been briefed probably in March of 2019 for the first time on this. So, yet again, we have Nancy Pelosi, right? Who's right. All roads lead to Putin when it comes to Trump. And that seems to be where we are again. This scandal has really taken on a lot of meaning very, very quickly. I think we have not heard a lot from Republicans yet. I think that as they are briefed and as more information comes to light, some of them will in fact speak, because the notion that an American president would stand by and do nothing in the face of these allegations is shocking. But Trump didn't do nothing. In fact, in March of this year, he canceled a G7 meeting with our European allies, our closest allies, and suggested that what he wanted to do was invite Russia into the G7. So that is apparently Putin's reward for taking out contracts on American soldiers. We don't know for certain that any deaths actually resulted, but there was reporting today that said that this first came to light because they were watching financial transfers. It was a follow the money situation. That implies that there was a payment made by Russia, an actual bounty payment, which implies that there were some documented deaths.
Well, one of this president's stock and trade strategies is diversion. As we all know, when things are going bad for him, he simply diverts the public's attention to another topic. And he's unfortunately been pretty successful with this. And the American attention span doesn't seem to be long enough to make sure he's held accountable for any of these things. But we're in the middle of a pandemic, and at the same time, people are marching in the streets across the country for criminal justice reform. When it feels like the world is on fire and there's so many pressing issues, what can we as citizens do to keep pressure on our elected officials and stay focused on holding them accountable?
This is something that's been really elusive during this administration because, maybe on the one hand, there's just so much, right? I mean, it feels like there's been the scandal du jour for as long as I can remember, but also because Trump really is very good at diverting. And I noticed today how fascinating it was that the conversation over Trump's most recent issues with Russia is centered around whether it's okay to require the president to read his daily briefing or whether he doesn't have to read the whole thing because it's too long. He actually managed to divert the conversation onto those terms instead of having a conversation about his tolerance of Russian efforts to kill American service members, right? He's very good at that. What do we do? We are all people with, jobs or families. We have a lot of issues because of COVID-19 that we haven't previously faced, a lot of stress. I think it is very difficult to keep your eye on the entirety of this administration. So, what do we do as individuals? We stay as informed as we can. We listen to multiple sources. This will be shocking when I say this, but MSNBC should not be your only news source. You should look for multiple news sources and read from different perspectives. I even turn on Fox for an hour here and there to try to see what they're saying. I want to be exposed to as many news sources as possible, but I also want to be a critical observer of those news sources. So I will go back and look for the original source for numbers or statistics, or make sure someone actually said what they're quoted as having said. That is time consuming. And so I think we have to each pick the issues that matter the most to us and stay on top of them. Something I hear a lot is it's a waste of time to call my senators because they're Republicans. I don't think that that's true. I think our Republican senator needs to hear from us as much as our Democratic one does. Our Republican members of the House of Representatives also need to hear from us. And whatever your issue is, if you are focused on the fact that there are still migrant children who are separated from their families, if you're focused on rule of law issues, if Russia matters, if the government's response to COVID matters, I mean, take your pick of all the possible issues and scandals, but be up to date on your issue. And be a voice in the ear of your elected representatives who, after all, serve you, have to be responsive to you. And if you can convince enough of your friends and neighbors that an issue matters, then at some point you're going to impact that elected representative, even though I know sometimes that seems daunting and hopeless. It's not. They do listen. They count the calls too. So make sure that you're calling.
That's a really great point, I think, to keep in mind, is that we can't do everything, but we can all do something. And I think that's definitely something we should all take from this. And kind of on that note, since the murder of George Floyd, we have now experienced weeks of civil unrest and countless protests across the country, calling for police reform and the defunding of police. As a former U.S. attorney, how do you feel about calling for the defunding of police?
So let's talk about this. I bet most of you have figured this out by now, that funding the police is just a really bad label that implies something that defunding isn't meant to. So there are folks who are advocating for abolition of the police. That's what people sometimes think defunding means, but it doesn't. Abolition of the police is one thing, and there are folks who believe that we can create a society where police aren't necessary. So let's put that approach to the side for a minute. Then we have defunding the police. And what that means is not funding the police and making them first responders to all issues. Right now, if someone has a mental health issue, you dial 911 and the police respond. The police, and look, I'm not telling you anything that every chief and sheriff in North Alabama won't back up. They don't have the training that they need to respond when someone's having a psychotic break. It is dangerous for the police. It is dangerous for the people that are involved. It would be so much better to have funding that goes to mental health providers so that they can be the first responders in that situation. Similarly, all too often, police are put into the role of dealing with addicts and dealing with people who are having overdose deaths. Again, not trained to deal with addiction. So we need to fundamentally rethink what we expect the police to do. Increasingly, they are in a military model. I mean, just because they have sergeants and lieutenants, right? And their approach is very military. 19% of police officers nationwide have military backgrounds. It's higher in Alabama. We need to re-envision the police as guardians of the public, as public servants, and as peace officers. And the police want that as much, I think, as citizens do. Camden, New Jersey had a debacle on its hands with its police department. And they actually took their department down to the ground and built it back up, right? Fired everybody, rehired, new vision. And the chief likes to say that when it comes to policy, culture eats policy for lunch. You can write all the new policies that you want to write. You can have rules and regulations aplenty, but it's the culture inside of a police department that will control how the police interact with citizens. And if what you want is community policing, officers who know their communities, who are a part of their communities, who care about their communities, then you have to build that culture from the ground up. That's what defunding the police is about. It seems to me it's an awfully good policy, just a bad choice of name.
Yeah, thank you for kind of painting that picture a little bit more, because I do think a lot of people struggle with the phrasing of it and what that actually means. So I think hopefully that helps some people to kind of better understand.
We had some really heated dinner table conversation when that first came up, because my oldest kid actually does think it would be great to abolish the police. He understands pragmatically we're not there now, but he insisted that that was what defunding the police meant. And it was one of those rare, wonderful moments as a mom with grown children where you get to school them. So horrible situation, but a little moment of satisfaction for me.
Yeah, definitely a good mom moment for sure. Now, Trump claims he's done more for the Black community than any other president, and also that he's been successful at criminal justice reform. And I feel like I may already know the answer to this, but is that true?
I'm going to say no, Lisa. Joking aside, because, it is so easy, I think, with Trump to laugh it off and say it's just Trump. And I think we should resist that temptation. He's the president. When he makes these statements, he speaks with the full force of law, and we should treat them seriously. All too often, we're forced to dismantle them. So criminal justice reform is more than just police reform. It means reform of prosecutorial practices. It means reform of prisons. It means reform of how we treat people when they leave prison and come back to the community. And in Trump's view, the fact that he's handed out a couple of celebrity pardons and passed a First Steps Act in Congress, which, although an admirable start, was never fully funded, so it hasn't gone into effect, that's not criminal justice reform. But more fundamentally than that, I really reject this notion that we hear him articulate all too often, that when he's doing criminal justice reform, it's for the Black community, somehow as though only Black people are criminals in America. And of course, we know that's not true. I can tell you my statistics as U.S. attorney don't bear that out. Local prosecutions don't bear that out. Criminal justice reform, broad-based criminal justice reform, is long overdue in our country because there is, unfortunately, but undeniably, a strong element of racial discrimination that underlies the entire system. And smarter people than me can talk about why that is and whether or not it links back to convict labor and earlier than that to slavery. But undeniably, the statistics bear that out in everything from low-level misdemeanor prosecutions to capital punishment to the use of the death penalty. So for Trump to claim victory because he's pardoned a couple of folks is a little bit overblown, but also it's at a minimum racially insensitive. I'd go a little bit further and say offensive.
I think most of us would agree with you on that sentiment. Now let's switch gears a little bit to some more local issues. Criminal justice reform, as we were just speaking on, is an issue that matters here in Alabama. And we know that you initiated an investigation into Alabama's prisons during your tenure as U.S. Attorney. So can you kind of tell us about that situation and how significant of an issue that is for Alabamians?
Alabama's prisons are a train wreck. They're overcrowded, they're violent, they're aging, and they're decaying. And so we commenced in Alabama, and this is the first time DOJ had ever done this. Usually DOJ looks at one prison or one facility where people are incarcerated. And they kept asking me as we talked about opening this investigation, can't you just narrow it down to one prison? And finally they said, we'll spot you two. You can have two prisons. And I had to push back and just say, we cannot do that because the entire system is in crisis. And so we opened an investigation into all of the men's prisons in Alabama. My colleague in Montgomery, George Beck, had previously done an investigation into Tutwiler, the women's prison. We opened on Alabama's prisons to look at violence against prisoners, sexual violence against prisoners, both inmate on inmate and guard on prisoner, but also to look at the basic hygienic conditions of life. There were reports of open sewage running through facilities, of no bathroom facilities at different points in time, of food that was infested with bugs and rodents. The conditions in Alabama's prisons remind me of nothing so much as they remind me of concentration camps. I think that anytime you sort of raise that Nazi analogy, you're sort of losing the argument. But to be honest, the conditions in the prisons are horrific. DOJ ultimately released a report in April of 2019. So I resigned the night before President Trump was inaugurated. I had opened the investigation. It was my Trump successor, Jay Town, the US Attorney in Birmingham, who released that report. And I think that that tells you something, that it was an issue that both Jay and I worked on, and that we both felt compelled to move forward because the evidence was so strong. And he comes and speaks to my classes at the law school every semester. I always have my students read the full report. They always hate the report, but if you read it, and I would encourage all of you to do that, it's available online, you walk away with a clear picture of our prisons. The issue is this going forward. What's the solution? There are some great evidence-based best practices for reforming prisons. Unfortunately, Governor Ivey is pursuing building new prisons. She just wants to build 4 new mega prisons. All of the data says that you should put fewer people in prison for nonviolent first-time offenses, use your money to provide community support systems, and put those folks back into the workforce. And that really is the best way to handle these sort of issues. Instead, in Alabama, we will apparently be building 4 new mega prisons, although the process, frankly, is shrouded in a little bit of mystery. It's not clear if those will be built by government or if they'll be private prisons. It's something that we should all pay attention to, though. The prison system sucks an enormous amount of funding out of Alabama's general budget. And if we were able to get this problem under control, we could really have a lot of funding left for fair elections. In states use these sort of community reinvestment processes, and I'm talking now about conservative states. North Carolina has been closing prisons. Its program has been so successful. Texas has also used these programs to reduce the number of people in prison, to increase its workforce. Very successful. Asa Hutchinson, conservative governor in Arkansas, put the same sort of processes into play. So Alabama has a real generational opportunity here to either make a lulu of a bad investment to tie up our money building new prisons and just kick the can on this problem down the road, or to do something bold and smart. And I'll just leave it right there because it seems pretty clear about which way we're headed.
I think that's unfortunately true. And since we're talking about issues closer to home, we're in the midst of a critical election cycle. Let's discuss a topic I know is at the front of everyone's mind right now, which is voting. And the president seems to have been on a real rampage on Twitter recently, although that's not saying too much, claiming that mail-in voting will lead to lots of fraud. Is that true?
It is not true. There is no evidence that ties mail-in voting to fraud. You guys might recall that in 2017, Trump created an election integrity commission, and its sole mission was to search for voter fraud. And they had to shut the commission down a couple months in because they could not find any evidence of fraud. In fact, Alan King, the recently retired Jefferson County probate judge, was one of the Democrats appointed to that committee. Alan wrote what I thought was just a lovely 10-page letter explaining that what was really needed was renewed funding under the Help America Vote Act to help poor rural counties update their equipment so that there would not be the threat of hacking. We all remember that whole notion of hacking into election machinery. Alan advocated for that funding. His comments were never brought up for public discussion and were just sort of pretty much brushed under the table. And that commission closes because it couldn't find fraud. There are a number of states now that just use mail-in voting, right? Just widespread mail-in voting. People love it. You get a barcode. You can track your ballot every step of the way and see when it's counted. Looks a lot more safe and secure than using some of the machines that we use. But if you're not convinced by that, look a little bit closer to home. In 2011, I sued the state of Alabama under a legal provision called UOCAVA, which requires that overseas service members have adequate opportunity to vote. And in resolving that litigation, we ended up with a situation where service members overseas and their families who are with them can vote by mail. And it goes off without a hitch. And when our Secretary of State, John Merrill, goes out and speaks to voters, he often touts that as an example of something that he's done that's worked very well. So there is no reason that we couldn't have mail-in voting in Alabama. It's something that works well and that works without fraud.
Yeah, well, on that note, so when it comes to mail-in voting in Alabama, what does that look like and what are our options exactly when, especially this election cycle?
Alabama is one of the most restrictive states in the country when it comes to exercising your right to vote. Sort of an irony, here's voting law trivia. The federal constitution doesn't actually explicitly guarantee a right to vote. It talks about voting, but it never says you as citizens have a right to vote. Alabama's constitution was actually amended, I think, in 1989, and it explicitly guarantees the right to vote, which it calls the franchise. That's sort of lawyer lingo, the right to the franchise, the right to vote. But we have a guaranteed right to vote in this state. So what do? Do we have any early days of voting? Nope, no early days in Alabama. You've got to vote on a Tuesday. And we all know who that hits the hardest: working people who don't get paid if they're not at work and they don't have 4 hours to take off to go vote, right? No mail-in voting in Alabama. And when it comes to absentee voting, many states have what's called no excuse absentee voting. If you want to get an absentee ballot, you fill out an application and you can get it. Not only do we not have that in Alabama, you have to check the boxes for one of the qualifying excuses, things like I won't be in my home county on the day of the election, or I'll be out of state, or I'm in the hospital. The form in very aggressive language tells you that if you lie when you check the box, that you can be prosecuted for perjury. There is no box to check that lets you say, I'm afraid I might get COVID if I go to vote. So if you're just afraid you're going to get COVID, I guess put on a hazmat suit and be prepared to wait in line and run the risk of getting sick, because Alabama will not make it convenient for you to vote. even if you qualify for an absentee ballot, you still have to jump through a lot of hoops. You've got to send in a photocopy of your driver's license. And of course, if you're at home quarantining because you're high risk to get COVID and don't have access to a photocopy machine, that's really a difficult thing to do. You've also got to have people attest, notarize your signature, or have 2 witnesses when you mail your absentee ballot in. Again, very difficult if you're trying to social distance and quarantine. So Alabama has a ways on getting it right if in fact we will have an effective right to vote come November.
Well, you've told us about the federal lawsuits and the state lawsuits. When will people in Alabama know for certain what the state of play for voting will be in November?
Yeah, so this is an interesting situation because the Legal Defense Fund, the NAACP, has filed a lawsuit in federal court. And I'm sure y'all have seen they have had a little bit more success than anticipated. At least in 3 counties, they've taken away some of the requirement. Folks want to do curbside voting, where you can just sort of like what we're all doing with food right now, drive up and vote instead of having to go in. Secretary of State says, no, you can't do that. And in fact, there were individual polling places that have used that for a long time because it makes sense for voters with disabilities. If you have a wheelchair that won't fit through the security mechanism in the courthouse where you vote, you don't really have a good option except for curbside. But Merrill would shut that down as soon as he got wind it was going on in a polling place. And I'm not really clear on what his justification for that is, but he believes that that's not permissible. So at least in 3 counties now, a court has said that that can happen. That case can still be appealed up to the US Supreme Court. So that's not the final word. Similarly, there's recently been a case filed by the League of Women Voters in state court. That case is still in the preliminary injunction stage, but it asks the court for a panoply of relief, everything from early voting days to extreme measures for safety at the polls to no excuse absentee balloting. And so it'll be interesting to see what happens in that case. Here's the problem though. It means we've got to all stay up to date on these voting issues, and I suspect it will in some cases come down pretty close to the election. So just put a marker down now that you need to educate yourself on that. I think that there will be a good bit of press coverage. Certainly the Democratic Party will cover it. The Secretary of State's website is usually pretty good about being up to date. So go to a couple of different sources and make sure you know exactly how you can vote in the manner that's safest for you.
Great. Now, another thing that a lot of people are talking about right now is the not just the presidential election, but our Senate election that we have going on right now. Senator Doug Jones will be running against either Tommy Tuberville or Jeff Sessions. How do you feel about that race? I would love to hear your thoughts on that.
So full disclosure, I've known Doug for a long time. He was my boss for a while. I really like him a lot. I just think he's, very much what you see is what you get. There is recent polling in that race, and there is reason for Democrats to be encouraged. It shows that Doug is just within a few points against either one of those potential Republican opponents within the statistical margin of error. I think in a time when people are increasingly dissatisfied with the president's policies on a number of fronts. So let me just say, this is a strange thing to say about an election, but we're almost at a point in this country where we just need to set politics aside and do the right thing. I'm sure that many of you have seen the videos that are being put out by the Lincoln Project, which includes some of my good friends who are never have been deeply committed to party. They've set aside that party affiliation and said, we need to do the right thing. We don't want to wake up in 4 more years and not have a democracy left to fight for. I see Doug's race in many ways as being part of that narrative. And the real problem that we have in Alabama getting Democratic candidates elected is folks who just go in and pull the lever, right? It's so much easier just to pull the lever, check the box, vote for all the Republicans, and not go in individual races. And that's a death knell for candidates like Doug Jones. If people make a decision that they're not going to vote for Trump, maybe they won't vote for Joe Biden, maybe they just won't vote, or they'll write somebody in. It becomes that much easier for them to vote for Jones if they're convinced for whatever reason that the Republican candidate is inferior to this guy who's frankly proven himself to be fair, been very moderate, listened to Alabamians, listened on the issues. He's been a supporter of rural health care before COVID was even a blip on anybody's radar screen. There is a lot to like about Doug. And I'm going to just tell y'all, sometimes what people say becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. If people write off Doug Jones, that might become a self-fulfilling prophecy. The numbers in these most recent polls say that he can win this race against either opponent, and we should all be very encouraged by that.
I absolutely agree with that. It's nice to hear it coming from you too. So we've covered a lot of different topics in a relatively short amount of time. And there's so much going on with this administration every day and sometimes every hour. Things seem to change. So as we look ahead to the next 4.5 months, what should we be doing to get our country and our state through this challenging time?
The single most important thing that we can all do is prepare to vote. And that means a couple of different things. It means make sure that you're registered to vote. Check the address. Make sure that you're registered to vote at the polling place that you anticipate voting in. There was an incident in 2018 where a lot of students at Alabama A&M who had newly registered went in to vote and discovered that that wasn't their polling place, that they had been defaulted and their assigned polling place was at their homes. And many of them couldn't drive 3 or 4 hours home to vote. So check your registration. Because of something called the Motor Voter Act, your status as a voter can't be changed after 90 days ahead of the election. So I need to count the days out. I haven't done that yet. But once we get to day 89, go on to the app, vote.org. It'll let you check your registration. Make sure that you're registered, make sure that your address is correct, and take a screenshot of that on your phone or whatever you're using, just so you've got a physical record. That means that you're registered to vote. Have a plan. COVID complicates this. Mike Sag is one of the infectious disease experts at UAB. He has written an affidavit in the state voting rights lawsuit, and he says that he expects that we will be in a wide open phase 2 of the COVID infection when voting happens in November. Also, it's suspected it'll be a bad influenza season, so we've got a perfect storm of those two. That means if you can get an absentee ballot, get one. Do whatever you can do to sort of lessen the resource pull at the polls. But if you're going to vote in person, have a plan to go in at a time of day when you think your polling place will be reduced. Show up with masks and with water and with a folding chair because, Lord knows we're probably going to need them. There'll be fewer workers and it'll take longer to vote. Make sure that your friends and your neighbors are registered. Make sure that you all educate yourselves about candidates, not just the top of the ticket, but up ballot and down ballot, because we have seen in the last few weeks who your mayor, who's on your city council. These races all matter from the top of the ballot to the bottom of the ballot. Have a transportation plan to get to the polls. Stay up to date in case there are poll closings or you're moved to a different polling place. Do whatever it takes to vote in November. I think the reality is we all have to vote like our lives depend on it, because they probably do.
Absolutely. Oh, well, thank you so much, Joyce, for that. That was so incredible. I'm sure our audience has many questions. I can already see some coming in. But before we get to that real quick, just a reminder that if you are able to contribute and donate tonight, we would so appreciate anything that anyone's able to contribute. You can find the link to that again in the little chat box below. And every dollar that we receive now and going forward goes directly towards our cause and supporting Democratic candidates. So let's go over here to our Q&A section. Again, if you haven't gotten a question in yet and you have one, please go ahead and send it into the Q&A box below on your screen. Let me see here. Let's find a good one. Oh, these are on. We actually have a couple of really good ones. All right, here. Do you feel that the public schools will have to deal with liability issues as students and teachers are required to return to school when it is impossible to closely follow CDC guidelines for school reopenings?
Yeah, this is, I think, a very, very difficult question. And it's why we've seen so much suggestion that there might be legislation at either the federal or the state level to exempt certain businesses from liability. Typically, the state or an arm of the state has sovereign immunity that means that they're exempt from a civil lawsuit. We've seen that come up recently in the policing context. That can apply here as well. But something that I saw a law professor, Heidi Lee Feldman, writing about earlier this week was the fact that schools that are reopening in person are going to have to pay very inflated rates to get insurance because the insurers have made the assessment that there is no way they can keep people safe. So I expect that we'll see businesses, schools, public entities that will be made exempt. And that sort of forces you to ask the question, if you can't get somebody to write insurance because the risk is too great, then maybe the risk is too great to take.
Yeah, I know they just announced earlier or last week what the school openings are going to look like. So I'm sure that's at the front of a lot of people's minds right now.
Look, it's a really difficult issue. So I think we should make the effort to be open and objective about it. There's a problem if you don't open schools. Kids lose that time in schooling. Parents may be unable to go back to work. Socially, kids are delayed. I've got a 17-year-old who has been such a good sport about this, but he has not seen his friends since March, and he is just dying to go back to school. And also, once you get into higher education, if we want to continue to have a robust structure of private and public colleges in this state, they really have to find a way to reopen. So this is not a black and white issue. There are no easy answers. I think the reality is that we are going to have to adapt to a highly unusual situation, and it's going to be difficult.
Absolutely. We have one here that says, what do you think of Trump packing the courts during his term as president?
Well, I think Trump has done what the Constitution entitles him to do. The president, after all, gets to pick federal judges, and Republicans do a much better job than Democrats do of focusing on this issue. If anything, what we need to learn from the Merrick Garland fiasco, where Senator McConnell refused to let Barack Obama have a Supreme Court appointment in the last year of his term, something that was absolutely offensive and ludicrous. And this notion that they have filled every open position on the courts. I mean, there aren't vacancies. That never happens. They have been machine-like in continuing to confirm judges. No crisis, impeachment, or pandemic has kept them from confirming judges. On the circuit courts, their confirmations are virtually all white men, very young, very conservative, some with arguable qualifications. And you know what? That's what the Constitution says the president has the right to do. Democrats need to wise up and toughen up here. And maybe the presidential nominee isn't your first choice. But unless you want Donald Trump picking judges for the next 4 years, including likely more Supreme Court picks, then make that your one issue that you vote on.
Absolutely. I hope people are keeping that in mind. The Supreme Court, which we have seen has been vital in the past couple of weeks and decisions that they've made, how important.
If you can make one argument to your 18, 19, 20-year-old kids who don't want to vote because they think Joe Biden is as bad as Donald are appointed in 4 years, they're going to control your rights and your responsibilities throughout your adult life. This is generational change. I worry that sometimes younger voters aren't as in tune to that as Republican younger voters are.
Absolutely. Another question we have here, it says, do you have anything to say about any other political races across the country or in Alabama?
Golly, that's a big question.
Yeah.
I think it's frankly really exciting to see the diversity inside of the Democratic Party. I testified on the Hill, on the House side, in the run up to impeachment proceedings, and was deeply impressed by some of the young new breed of Democrats, especially the women. They were so smart and they were so prepared, and they brought so much diversity to the room, not just Black, white, brown diversity, which they brought, but also background, experience, approach. Everything from Val Demings, who's now sort of become a household name, Congresswoman from Florida, former police chief, recruited into police work out of a social work background. If you don't think somebody like that brings a lot of depth to the Congress, I mean, she's just fabulous and a real force of nature, along with some of the more prominent members, of course, the squad. So I think it's exciting now to see that expanding into the Senate races, where we have far more communities of color, or far more people of color, far more Black men. I mean, this could radically alter the Senate. You guys, this is so weird. I do this all the time on Zoom. Tonight, for some reason, both cats and dogs are trying to interfere. And this guy's sort of predatory, so we'll see what he does. But I think that these races that we're seeing across the country have so much to offer in terms of letting the Democratic Party truly evolve into a party that represents people. I think in 2025, Texas makes the demographic shift where it becomes majority minority. And increasingly, we're seeing candidates that reflect that. And that's good. I mean, it's just, there is no doubt that we make better decisions as a party when more diverse people have a seat at the table.
Absolutely. That's something I've definitely been excited about, seeing younger people, more diverse people running for office and being elected. It's very exciting to see. I think we have a couple more here that we'll go through, and then we'll kind of wrap things up. Someone asked, are there any good books that you've read lately that you would like to recommend?
So, I confess I'm not a huge reader. Not because I don't love to read. I absolutely love to read, but I'm supposed to be writing this summer. But I did sneak a little bit of time away. Connie Schultz, who is the wife of Ohio Senator Sherrod Brown, has a first novel out. It's called The Daughters of Erie-Town. It's really, really great. So you should read Connie's book. That's my only good summer read that I've read so far. But, I will say, Eddie Glad, who I am a huge fan of, a Princeton professor who studies racial issues in a very thoughtful way, and who writes beautifully. Eddie has a new book out, and I'm going to blank out on its name. I listened to the first chapter of it this morning while I was walking my dog on Audible, which is how I often listen to books. And his last name is spelled Glaude, if you're not familiar with him. I think just based on that one chapter that he has written a book that will help us as we sort of struggle through these very difficult racial issues that face the country. And how do we look at other people's perspectives and lived experiences in a way that benefits everyone in the community? So I'm actually really looking forward to finishing that book.
Oh, that definitely sounds like a good read. I hope people were writing that down. Here we have another question. Is there a way that the Republicans, either as part of the convention or outside of it, can replace Trump as the nominee? I know there's been mumblings of that.
Yeah. So I think that there are some things that theoretically could happen. Their voting process has been a little bit light this year. But look, as a practical matter, that's not going to happen. Donald Trump is going to be the Republican nominee. There are reports tonight that say that many of Mitt Romney's high-level staff people are beginning to work for the Biden campaign. They're doing it openly. They're organizing Romney supporters for Joe Biden. The core of the Republican Party, the place where if there was going to be a challenge, it would come from, those folks are acting like Donald Trump is going to be the nominee. And so I think that that's probably definitive.
Well, I think that's, I don't know if that's good news or bad news. I don't know what kind of, I don't know how to feel about that. Well, thank you again so much. And thank you to everyone who sent in questions to us and for attending part 2 of our Synergy speaker series. We are excited to announce that our next speaker in our series will be columnist John Archibald on July 14th. And we're very excited about that. So be sure to save the date on that. Again, that was July 14th, John Archibald. So stay tuned to our newsletter, social media. We'll be putting that information out for everybody to sign up again in 2 weeks' time. So, and if you enjoyed this event, again, we want to encourage you to help support our cause. And again, Joyce, thank you so much for being here with us again. This was such a great conversation, and we look forward to seeing and hearing from you more as you proudly represent the rest of us Alabamians.
Well, thanks for having me. I hope that maybe within the next year, I'll get to see all of you all in person. We have a lot of work ahead.
Yes, we do. We do indeed. Yes, we hope to see everyone in person soon, but safely, of course. So thank you all again for being here, and good night.